Give everybody a second to hop on.
Do you guys like coffee? Have you tried it?
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for our Community Platica this week. I hope you're having a happy Friday. My space is a little louder than it usually is, which I'm a little annoyed because I'm like, this is my coffee shop. I don't know what people think this is. My sorority sister and I found the perfect spot for us to sit and study and work from home. It's in Northeast. It's in the neighborhood, and it's usually pretty chill. But it might be a little bit of a busy time right now. Anyway, I hope you're having a good Friday. My Friday started out with a dentist appointment, and I'm pretty afraid of the dentist, so that was fun. But I got my teeth cleaned, so it's exciting. Thank you for joining us for our Community Platica this week. We are chatting all about our article this week, which I'm really excited that I had the honor to meet Dr. Bates. He's actually part of our book study this month, thanks to Connie Springfield, Connie Springfield, who works with him, and told him about our book this month. Our book, if you're interested in joining us still, it's around here somewhere. I'll find it. But Dr. Bates joined our book study this past Monday, and he talked to us about becoming educators. Our book study book this month. Feel free to join us if you have the opportunity this month. So anyway, Dr. Bates, the author of this article, is a part of our book study, and we're really excited about that. He is the director of ethics and inclusion over in Shawnee Mission, so we're really excited that our article comes from a local educator this week. So the title of our article is "Let's Reinvent Systems of Oppression Rather Than Reformatting Them." Let me know if you can't hear me, and I can always move spaces as well. So let's reinvent systems of oppression rather than reformatting them. I was really interested in pulling up this article when he mentioned it in our book study, because the beginning of our book talks about how the education system really is doing a number, and it makes it really difficult for Black and Latino males to be successful in schools. That's what the book is all about: strategies, mindsets, and beliefs for supporting male Black and Latino students. So Dr. Bates brought up his article because we kind of, COVID came up and school reopenings and all of that. And so we had the discussion of, like, is there at a point, like, are we at a time in society when we really should just throw away the whole education system and dismantle it and start over again, which is really what his article is about. Instead of like reformatting the school system, how about we just reinvent it? So Dr. Bates talks about the criminal justice system in this article. He talks about the education system, and so he's coming at it from a lot of different angles. He begins the article with police brutality being like his main, or like the first thing he mentions as a reasoning for why to just reinvent the police system, or even defund it. He starts out the article by talking about the origins of the police department and how they had a racist, like legitimate racist beginning back in the mid 1800s here in America. So he goes on to say that we need to reinvent these systems that are affected by a disease far more deadly than anthrax, swine flu, Ebola, the plague, and the novel coronavirus. He says that our systems have been really plagued by a disease called racism for 400 plus years. I really like his perspective on this, and I was like, yes, when I saw that our family Cornell Ellis is quoted in the article. Cornell says that an ally takes up space, but an accomplice takes up risk. So when I was reading this article, I kind of stuck with that for a while. Again, it says an ally takes up space, but an accomplice takes up risk. The term accomplice first was told to me this year by Edgar as a person who is, as a part of a movement who is dismantling a system. But the connotation behind accomplice really sounds negative, right? Like, and maybe to some people, an accomplice to dismantling the education system would be negative, right? But again, an ally takes up space, but an accomplice takes up risk. So when we are in a time where everyone's exploring how to be the best ally for Black Americans, for Latinx students, for Latinx people, for immigrants, for so many people who are right now in the fights, in the fight for their lives, for their freedom, for their liberation. So many people are considering being allies or exploring being allies to these marginalized demographics. And the article goes on to challenge people to move on from being allies to being accomplices. And so furthermore, right after that says, engaging to reinvent racist systems of oppression requires all to be accomplices of those who have been victimized, dehumanized, emasculated, and murdered by these infected systems. An accomplice, this is what an accomplice does, according to Dr. Bates, speaks up against the outcomes of institutional racism, makes room for those who are not at the table where decisions are made for them, does the work of learning themselves and the experiences of others without placing the burden of teaching on those who are the subject of their learning. So I suggest we heal ourselves, then we become authentic accomplices. I'm so sorry, it's so loud in here. Let me go back because I kind of want to go step by step in each of these ways to be an accomplice. So an accomplice speaks up against the outcomes of institutional racism. There are a lot of examples of institutional racism in our country, whether you're talking criminal justice, you're talking education, you're talking medical fields. There's institutional racism that really runs deep in the origins and the foundations of our country as a whole. And so thinking about what those outcomes mean, before then who talked about people who have been victimized, dehumanized, emasculated, and murdered. Next, being an accomplice would mean making room for those not at the table where the decisions are being made for them. Anytime I hear something along those lines, I think about how nonprofits who serve majority Black and Brown people are made up of their boards are made up of 70% white people. So again, nonprofits who serve majority Black and Brown people are made up by 70% white people in their boards. And so where can people that are already a part of those nonprofit boards make room for the people who are being impacted, the communities that are being impacted by the decisions that get made at that nonprofit? Now, nonprofit is just one sector of our society, right? We're also talking school boards. We're talking boards of other organizations that are not nonprofits. So that's something to think about as well. The last part, or actually I guess there's two parts left, does the work of learning themselves. I had a conversation, I was lucky enough to have a conversation earlier this week with Diana Munoz and Jocelyn Todd and Lucero Valderrama. And we talked about how the beginning of equity work for everyone has to be learning about our own identities and dismantling and dissecting the biases and the stereotypes that we bring into every space we walk into. And that means, especially in education, that means in a nonprofit, that means in all senses of the word bias and stereotype, right? So a bias that I brought up in our discussion was my bias that I had about white people growing up was that all white people are rich. I guess it was more of a stereotype. And that was just what I thought. I don't know. And I kind of maybe attribute it to watching Full House as a kid. But as a teacher, as an educator, as someone who's going to serve white people, who's going to serve Black people, who's going to serve Latinx people, I had to really work through those biases and through those stereotypes before I expected to be an equitable educator and before I expected to be an anti-racist educator. That's just one example. And then lastly, an accomplice learns about themselves and the experiences of others without placing the burden of the teaching on those who are the subject of their learning. So not only reaching out to your only Latinx friend or to your Latinx friend about Latinx issues. Several times I'd gotten asked if I had watched on Netflix. There was a show earlier this year, not Immigration Nation. There was a show earlier this year about the immigration experience. What was the name of the show? I can't remember the name of the show. But now there's this new show on Netflix called Immigration Nation. And so several times already I've been asked by non-Latinx people, have you seen Immigration Nation? In hey, it relates to you, or perhaps relates to you and your experience, you should go watch it. And I think the intentions are let's have a discussion about it mixed in with your experience with immigration and the immigration system. But it ultimately becomes a burden when the only learning that we're gaining about certain systems of oppression are through the people who are being impacted by those systems, who are being oppressed by those systems. I did finally watch it took me some time, but I watched the first episode of Immigration Nation last night. And I cried once I started crying, I pretty much didn't stop for the last 25 minutes. And my husband, after the first episode, was like, all right, that's enough for me for now. And then as we were kind of going to bed, we had this discussion about that really is our story, right? Watching Immigration Nation, it really is the fear that we had as kids. My mom being undocumented my whole childhood and up into my adulthood. The fear that you have is our lives. And so it is exhausting to not just watch shows like that, to try to engage with other people who maybe aren't a part of those oppressive systems or haven't been oppressed by those systems. It's exhausting to have that conversation. So anyway, Dr. Bates in his article talks about that being his take on how to become more of an accomplice and move from being just an ally to oppressed people. Then he goes on in his article. If you just joined us, we're on our Platica about our article, Let's Reinvent Systems of Oppression Rather Than Reformatting Them. So we're talking about, it's come up a lot, I feel like, in the last week for me, dismantling instead of reformatting. So then Dr. Bates goes on to talk about how this impacts us as educators. So he goes on this metaphor, this analogy about imagine your whole life, which is really what we're taught, right? That dinosaurs are extinct. So our whole lives, we learn in school that dinosaurs are extinct. And he's like, imagine then leaving 12th grade and entering a higher institution and then seeing a dinosaur. So that analogy is similar to racism, which is like when we did talk about racism in our K through 12 education, it was like, really, I feel like for me, it was slavery and civil rights movement were the two main things that we learned about equity and the racist system that we live in, and the movement of Black Americans to freedom and to liberation, right? We had very little, if any, discussions about any other marginalized communities and their fight for freedom and their fight for liberation. And then, even then, though, the discussion was, oh, that's over, though. Dr. Martin Luther King solved the problem. And so here we are, happy and healthy because we get to go to school together and everything is equal, right? When now as educators, we know that is not the case. Hey, Elizabeth, thanks for watching with us. Girl, I just watched the first couple episodes last night too, but it was traumatic and triggering for us to watch. I totally agree, Elizabeth. We're talking about an immigration nation. If you just joined us, I just couldn't stop crying. I was like, this isn't healthy. And just, yes, Elizabeth, yes. Hey, Lori, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us. So if that's okay, girl, we here till whenever we're done. So we're talking about our Platica this week. Dr. Bates, Diversity and Inclusion Director over in Shawnee Mission, wrote an article, Let's Reinvent Systems of Oppression Rather Than Formatting Them. So let's talk about what that means for educators in Dr. Bates' eyes. Hey, Dr. Clark, so good to see you. Thank you so much for being here. So for educators, we need to first recognize that perhaps there are some critical things about people in society that they have not learned about. What about ourselves as educators can we change to make sure we're not in front of a classroom and have this attitude of like, I'm the expert and you're the learner, and so everything that we're going to discuss, I know everything about. Because if, as people with different upbringings, different types of learning, different areas of the country you're from, different areas of the world that you're from, you're going to bring a different perspective. So changing our tone and our perception to kids that, look, I'm not the expert and I don't know everything. Hi, Sylvia. Thank you for joining us. We were talking about Immigration Nation on Netflix. It is very difficult to watch, so heads up on that. So first, Dr. Bates says we should recognize the things we don't know and then go learn about them. It is our responsibility to walk into our classrooms and analyze and evaluate the students that we're working with and like pick out the things that, hey, I should probably learn more about that. I should probably go do some research about that. For example, when I was in the classroom, I taught a lot of students who were Muslim. I didn't know very much about the culture, and even though I had grown up in Northeast and I grew up with people who were Muslim, there were business owners who were Muslim in the neighborhood, but I think it's because there was an invisibility of it at school that it was like, okay, you're Muslim and like that's it. Like, we're not gonna learn about it. We didn't learn about it in school. So thank you, Elizabeth, girl, you be having my back. Elizabeth put that link of the article in the chat if you'd like to follow with us. So Dr. Bates says that it's important to start actively learning more about the students that enter our classrooms with regards to students that don't look like us, that we don't understand. Go get an understanding. Don't wait around for it. Where is it? You may ask. It's in the community, in the culture of the students that you serve. If you go into these spaces, the grocery store, the laundromat, shopping centers, recreation spaces, with authentic curiosity, the learning process will begin organically. Now, I agree. I know that there were times in some of the educational institutions I was in where we'd be told, just make sure you leave school before dark and make sure you don't walk to the parking lot alone, and things along those lines that gave the negative connotation that the neighborhood and the community was inherently bad and inherently dangerous, when that just wasn't the case. I was told this one time, and I told the person that I live in the neighborhood, and that I'm safe pretty much all of the time. I've been, knock on wood, lucky enough that things haven't happened to me while I'm walking to my car, and it doesn't happen every time people do walk to their car. But having that mindset and that bias already in your mind, and then trying to approach a classroom full of students that live in that neighborhood, that's a problem. It's problematic. So Dr. Bates talks about you exploring that community with authentic curiosity, without the clipboard, without this circus feeling, right? Like, I'm from the outside looking in, and I want to go watch all these people and do it. Go interact, go understand what the culture and how it's developed, the history of the neighborhood, the reason why the neighborhood looks like it looks, the neighborhood, why the demographics are the way that they are, right? I really am excited that this was our article this week, because shout out to Dr. Bates. He's a local educator doing really good work. He finishes up with the article with, for those of us becoming accomplices in the fight against racism, be prepared to be subjected. This is important. For those of us who are considering becoming accomplices in the fight against racism, be prepared to be subjected to the same pain, humiliation, discrimination, defamation, disenfranchisement, frustration, and exhaustion associated with that decision. So, as we work to become accomplices, let's not focus on being perfect, but rather being better than we were yesterday. Let's reinvent rather than reform. That's powerful to know that in becoming an accomplice to dismantling racist systems, there's a chance I'm going to be subjected to the same pain, humiliation, discrimination, etc., that the people who are parts of those demographics that are being marginalized and oppressed feel every single day. Dr. Clark, thank you so much. I've always been told to stay humble. Remember, you learn from your students as much as they learn from you. Absolutely. If not, some days more. When we're in front of students, there's 25 to 1, right? And there's 20 to 1, or my first year of teaching, 35 to 1. And so there's so much richness in the culture of every single person in that room, even people from the same racial backgrounds, people from the same ethnic backgrounds, people from the same gender. I mean, you're going to have differences different intersectionalities within each demographic as well. So there are days when I'm learning more from my students than they're learning from me. So yes, Dr. Clark, staying humble is, I'm going to bring your comment back up, is is important here. I think Edgar and I, in a conversation yesterday, were talking about how the LEC and our organization tries to always lead with humility, because Edgar and I don't know everything. I don't know everything. As a teacher, I don't know everything. And my experience is unique to my life. So even though you might consider that I am a first generation, so there's oppression that comes from that. My parents were immigrants. There's oppression that comes from that. My parents are now divorced. All these systems of oppression that you live under. It doesn't mean that I can represent every person who also lives with the same identities or with similar identities. In our equity training earlier this week with Chris Ray, it was Latinos are not a monolith. right? And that's to be said for so many things. Women are not a monolith. Teachers are not a monolith. But with our article this week, if you're just joining us, we are discussing our Platica this week. Let's reinvent systems of oppression rather than reformatting them by Dr. Bates. So, as educators, though, we have the responsibility of learning about our students and learning what's important to them and what's important to their communities so we can serve them in that way. I do encourage, for if you don't know much about allyship versus accomplishship, for you to do some of that research. Dr. Bates brings it up in his article. And like I said, it's new to me, allyship versus accomplishship. Accomplishment being that you are actively working to dismantle a system of oppression. Like I mentioned earlier, my husband and I watched Immigration Nation last night. Only one episode because it was hard to watch. But there was a moment in the show when one of the ICE agents said something along the lines of, yes, families are being separated. Yes, kids are being torn from their parents, et cetera, et cetera. But I haven't done that. And my team doesn't do that. And so can't blame all of ICE, right? And that was a trigger point for me, a trigger moment for me, because that is a system of oppression. That's what our article is about not reformatting it, but because that ICE agent is one ICE agent of the thousands, and really the thousands that have been hired recently in the last couple of years. Anyway, so we're working toward being accomplices if you are willing to be a part of the work to dismantle systems of oppression. The consideration is to dismantle systems, to reinvent systems instead of reformatting and reforming them. A lot to think about, especially moving into this really unique school year. Think about how, if you're willing, and if it seems to be part of your path, how you're willing to work to dismantle a lot of elements of the education system. As always, the Latinx Education Collaborative, we appreciate your support. Let us know how we can support you this year. If you haven't yet, we have our micro grants that have been sent out to teachers to help them get started on the new school year. Go to our website, latinxedco.org. If you haven't yet, send me an email, Susana at latinxedco.org. If you're looking for a position, I have many of those, knowledge of so many of those, so please email me. We have Evolucion that finally has a date, our annual Evolucion conference, October 24th, Saturday, October 24th. So save that date, put it in your calendar so you don't do anything else that day or that morning. We have our new PLC segments on Wednesday evenings, Professional Learning Achievement with Dr. Erica Hernandez-Scott. So don't miss out on things, but as always, I am here for you. Let me know how I can support you or how I can support the educators that you know. And we will see you for Community Platica next week. Have a good weekend, everyone. Stay safe, stay cool, and we'll see you next week. Bye, guys.